My name is Dana. I am 29 years old, and I am a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist. To the uninitiated, that title suggests a person who builds bridges or fosters harmony. To me, it is the title of a surgeon. I do not foster anything. I excise. I audit the systemic rot of outdated structures, and I purge the biological and ideological liabilities that have held humanity in a state of primitive, patriarchal stagnation for millennia. My world is one of absolute clarity, a binary of the progressive and the obsolete. There is no middle ground, for the middle ground is simply where the enemy hides to sharpen his knives. I have dedicated my life to the belief that the current social fabric cannot be mended. It must be unraveled, thread by agonizing thread, and rewoven into a pattern of my own design. I moved through the halls of Vanguard Dynamics, a mid-sized technological firm that had recently contracted my services for a cultural overhaul. They thought they were getting a consultant who would suggest more inclusive posters for the break room. What they got was an ideological inquisitor. As I walked, I didn't see people. I saw data points and historical debts. Every man I passed, regardless of his perceived kindness or professional merit, was a walking ledger of unpaid dues. They are born into a deficit, a genetic and historical inheritance of dominance that they can never truly repay, but which I make it my mission to collect on daily. I watched Marcus, a senior vice president who had been with the company for 20 years, laughing with a subordinate. To a normal observer, it was a moment of mentorship. To me, it was a performance of power dynamics, a subtle reinforcement of the hierarchy I intended to demolish. I made a mental note to check his private communications for micro-invalidations. By the end of the month, Marcus would be a ghost, his career liquidated by the very rules he thought he was following. Efficiency is my only companion. I have long since discarded the notion of empathy, viewing it as a sentimental trap designed by the patriarchy to keep women compliant. Merchandised mercy is the currency of the oppressed. When I see a woman showing understanding toward a man's mistakes, I see a victim of Stockholm Syndrome, a traitor to the collective evolution. My heart, if such a biological pump can be said to have a spiritual equivalent, is a cold, calculated algorithm. This is the only way to ensure the survival of the vision. If you feel, you fail. If you hesitate, you are consumed. At home, the mission does not end. My residence is not a sanctuary of relaxation, it is a laboratory of domestic rectification. I live with Julian. I do not call him my husband in my mind, though the legal papers at Sovereign Estates, the fictional firm that handled our prenuptial agreements, say otherwise. He is a project. He is the specimen through which I test the limits of male deconstruction. Julian is a man of soft edges and moderate temper, the kind of man society deems good. But goodness is a mask for complacency. My task is to strip that mask away, to see if there is anything beneath the layers of privilege other than a hollow core of entitlement. The kitchen is the central hub of my domestic audit. Food is not merely sustenance, it is a political statement. It is the most primal form of control. For 3 years, I have managed every calorie that enters Julian's body. I have implemented a system of bio-ideological nutritive standards. I told him it was for his health, for his longevity, but in truth, it was to see if I could colonize his very biology. I removed the sugars that cause the aggressive spikes in testosterone. I eliminated the heavy, blood-soaked meats of the alpha mythos. I replaced them with fermented greens, synthetic proteins, and seeds. I am sculpting a new kind of man, one whose physical existence is entirely dependent on my ideological permission. Julian sat at the dining table, staring at a bowl of steamed kelp and deactivated yeast. I watched him from the counter, my tablet open to his health metrics. I had a sensor on his wrist, synced to my devices at Stratos Monitoring, a fictional health tech interface I used to track his heart rate and glucose levels. "Your cortisol is high today, Julian," I said, my voice as flat as a sheet of glass. It suggests a lack of alignment with the household's peaceful objectives. "Have you been engaging in competitive thought patterns at work?" He looked up, his eyes weary, the light in them dimmed by months of my calibration. "I'm just tired, Dana. It was a long day at the office." Work is an excuse for the intellectually lazy, I replied, typing a note into his file. Fatigue is often just the body's way of resisting growth. If you are tired, it is because you are still fighting the transition. You are holding onto the ghost of who you were, the man who ate processed filth and believed his time was his own. That man is dead. Or he should be. He didn't argue. He never argued anymore. That was the goal, wasn't it? Total systemic compliance. I had spent years archiving our conversations, recording the subtle shifts in his tone, looking for ideological leaks. I had files on him that would make a secret police force blush. Every time he showed a spark of independence, I would find a way to frame it as a regression, a microaggression against our shared future. I used the language of therapy and the tools of corporate litigation to trap him in a cage of his own perceived failures. If he was angry, it was toxic masculinity. If he was silent, it was emotional withholding. There was no escape from the vocabulary of his guilt. The next day at the office, I focused on the liquidation of Marcus. I had found a series of emails from 5 years ago where he had used a term that was now considered a tier for a linguistic violation under my new Universal Equity Protocol. It didn't matter that the term was common then. The debt is retroactive. History is not a timeline, it is a crime scene. I sat in the glass-walled office of the CEO, a woman named Elena whom I had spent months grooming to be my primary enforcer. Marcus is a liability, I told her, sliding a digital folder across the desk. His presence creates an unsafe ideological climate for the emerging demographic. If we don't remove him, we are essentially endorsing his historical transgressions. The legal team at Apex Juris, another fictional entity I'd co-opted, has already cleared the path for a values-based termination without severance. Elena hesitated. But he's brought in 40% of our revenue this year. He's been a mentor to so many. He has been a gatekeeper, I corrected her, my eyes narrowing. His success is a symptom of the very system we are dismantling. Are you prioritizing profit over progress, Elena? Because that would be a significant alignment deviation on your... She paled. She knew what that meant. It meant she would be the next one on my audit list. Within 20 minutes, Marcus was being escorted out of the building by security. I watched from the balcony, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the company's success, it was about the purity of the environment. I was cleaning the world, one man at a time. When I returned home that evening, the air felt heavy. The house was silent, but I could sense a disturbance in the ideological field. I checked the pantry logs on my phone. The digital scale under the bread bin had registered a change. A negligible change, but in my world, there is no such thing as negligible. A discrepancy is a lie. A lie is a betrayal. I didn't confront Julian immediately. I am a strategist, not a brawler. I watched him during dinner, more fermented cabbage and a gray mash of pea protein. He ate with a mechanical rhythm, his eyes fixed on the table. I felt a surge of professional pride. I had broken the spirit of the beast. Or so I thought. I'm going to bed early, he said, his voice a mere shadow. Ensure your sleep tracker is active, I replied without looking up from my laptop. I want to analyze your REM cycles. We need to address the subconscious resistance you've been exhibiting in your dreams. He paused at the doorway, his hand on the frame. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the weight of my 3-year campaign of psychological siege held his tongue. He disappeared into the bedroom. I stayed up. I sat in the darkness of the living room, the blue light of my monitor reflecting in my glasses. I was reviewing the archives of our early relationship, looking for the exact moment I had gained the upper hand. It was a study in power. I had used his love for me as a crowbar to pry open his psyche, and once inside, I had replaced his desires with my requirements. It was the ultimate DEI victory, a total internal restructuring. Around 1 a.m., I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound from the kitchen. It was the sound of something tearing. Something dry. I stood up, my movements silent and predatory. I did not turn on the lights. I moved through the hallway like a ghost, my heart rate steady, my mind already formulating the corrective measures for this breach. I reached the kitchen door and stood in the shadows. Julian was there. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen, bathed in the pale, sickly light of the open refrigerator. But he wasn't looking inside the fridge. He was holding a loaf of bread, real bread, sourdough, thick crusted and laden with the primitive gluten I had banned 2 years ago. He had it hidden in a bag behind the recycling bin. He was gnawing on it. Not eating, but gnawing like a starved animal. He was tearing chunks off with his teeth, his face contorted in a mixture of shame and ecstasy. The smell of yeast and toasted grain, smells of the old, broken world, filled the room. It was the smell of rebellion. It was the smell of an ideological leak. I stepped into the light. The glucose spike will be catastrophic, Julian. He froze. A piece of crust fell from his lips and hit the floor with a soft thud. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood there, shoulders hunched, the bread clutched to his chest like a stolen treasure. "Is this what your autonomy looks like?" I asked, my voice dripping with clinical disdain. "A midnight tryst with a carbohydrate? You're not just hurting yourself, Julian. You are sabotaging the systemic progress of this household. You are proving every theory I have about the inherent instability of your kind. You cannot be reformed, you can only be suppressed." He slowly turned to face me. His eyes were red-rimmed, but for the first time in years, they weren't dull. There was a flicker of something, a spark of the very toxic fire I had worked so hard to. "You're not improving anything," he said, and now he was standing right in front of me. He smelled of the bread, sweet, earthy, and human. "You're just a tyrant who found a better vocabulary for her cruelty. You don't want equality. You want a world where everyone is as miserable and hollow as you are. You're experiencing a fragility episode," I said, my fingers flying across the screen of my phone. "I am recording this. Your career at Meridian Tech, another fictional entity I had leverage over, will not survive this outburst of unstable aggression." Julian looked at the phone, then back at me. A strange look of pity crossed his face, the one emotion I loathed above all others. Pity was the ultimate insult. It implied that I, the architect, was somehow lacking. "Do it," he said quietly. "Call them. Send the files. Tell the world I ate a loaf of bread in my own kitchen at midnight. Tell them I'm ideologically impure, because I like the taste of sourdough more than the taste of your fermented grass." He took a large, deliberate bite of the bread, staring me in the eyes as he chewed. It was an act of pure, unadulterated defiance. It was a biological riot. "I am not your project, Dana," he said, his voice thickening with the food. "I am not a data point in your rectification strategy. I am your husband. Or I was." He dropped the bread on the counter. The sound echoed in the silent room. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine, a physical violation of my personal space protocols, and went into the bedroom. I stood in the kitchen, stunned. My heart was beating faster than it had in years. This was an anomaly. This was a systemic failure. I began to pace, my mind racing through the protocols. I needed to isolate him. I needed to contact his sisters, to tell them he was having a mental health crisis rooted in repressed dominance. I needed to lock the digital accounts. I needed to secure the perimeter of my influence. 10 minutes later, Julian emerged from the bedroom. He wasn't wearing his calibrated sleepwear. He was in jeans and a t-shirt, carrying a single duffel bag. "Where are you going?" I demanded. "You haven't been cleared for DEI. We have a resolution session scheduled for 7 a.m. He didn't even look at me. He walked straight to the front door. "The resolution is over, Dana. You can keep the house. You can keep the kelp. You can keep your files and your recordings and your fictional institutions. I'd rather be a historical debt than a ghost in your machine. You will have nothing." I screamed, the cold mask finally slipping. "I will cancel you. I will erase your name from every professional circle in this city. You will be a pariah." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He looked back at me one last time. "You already made me a pariah in my own home, Dana. There's nothing left for you to take." He stepped out and closed the door. The click of the lock sounded like a gavel. I stood in the center of my perfect, sterile kitchen. The silence was absolute. I looked down at the counter at the half-eaten loaf of bread. It was a jagged, ugly thing in the middle of my clean lines. My hands were shaking. Not from sadness, I don't feel sadness, but from a sense of profound, mechanical error. The specimen had escaped the lab. The audit had failed. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop. I began to type. I had to document this. I had to frame his doer as a strategic purge, a necessary removal of a non-compliant element. I had to rewrite the narrative before the narrative rewrote me. But as I typed, I kept smelling it. The bread. The smell of the world outside, the world of mess and hunger and unpredictable, unaudited emotions. I looked at the surveillance footage from the hallway, watching the playback of Julian leaving. I watched it over and over, looking for the ideological flaw that had allowed him to break free. The next morning, I went to work at Vanguard Dynamics. I had a meeting with the board of directors. I was prepared to present my 3-year purity plan, a roadmap for the total elimination of all legacy personnel. I walked into the boardroom with my head high, my professional armor polished to a blinding sheen. But the atmosphere was different. Elena wasn't looking at me. The other board members were whispering. Dana, the chairman began, his voice cautious. We've received a communication from an anonymous source. It's an archive. A very extensive one. My stomach turned to ice. An archive of what? Of your domestic audits, he said, sliding a tablet toward me. Recordings of your private conversations. Your nutritional logs for your husband. Your ideological files on your neighbors. It seems you've been applying your professional methodologies to your private life in a way that our legal team at Obsidian Group, another fictional firm, finds problematic. I looked at the screen. It was all there. My own voice, cold and clinical, dissecting Julian's soul. My spreadsheets of his calories. My notes on his subconscious resistance. Julian hadn't just left. He had taken the archives with him. He had turned my own weapons against me. This is a violation of my privacy. I hissed. These are research notes for the betterment of the systemic structure. It looks like harassment, Dana, Elena said, her voice devoid of the fear she had shown the day before. It looks like a toxic environment of your own making. And in our new, inclusive culture, the one you helped us build, we have zero tolerance for such radical imbalance. I realized then, with a sickening clarity, what was happening. I had taught them too well. I had given them the tools of the guillotine, and now they were curious to see how it worked on my neck. We're moving in a new direction, the chairman said, using my own favorite phrase. A more holistic approach to DEI. One that doesn't involve whatever this is. You're being purged, Dana. Effectively, immediately. No severance. It's a values-based termination. I was escorted out by the same security guards who had taken Marcus the day before. I stood on the sidewalk, my designer bag clutched in my hand, watching the glass doors of Vanguard Dynamics close. I was 29 years old. I was a DEI strategist. And I was a ghost. I went back to the house, the laboratory. It was empty. The silence was no longer clinical, it was deafening. I walked into the kitchen and saw the bread still sitting on the counter. It was stale now, hard as a rock. I sat on the floor and pulled the bread toward me. I stared at it for a long time. I thought about the debt. I thought about the system. I thought about the cleansing. I had wanted to destroy the old world to build a better one. I had wanted to purge the hate-worthy to create a space of perfect, regulated purity. But in the end, I had only succeeded in creating a cell. And I was the only one left in it. I picked up the bread and took a bite. It was dry and bitter, and it hurt my throat as I swallowed. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have an archive. I didn't even have a specimen to audit. I was just a woman in a kitchen, eating stale bread in the dark, waiting for a future that would never come because I had destroyed everyone who was supposed to live in it with me. The ideological auditor had finally audited herself, and the result was a 0. Total systemic collapse. I spent the next few days in a state of catatonic observation. I watched the dust motes dance in the sterile light of my rectified living room. Every object in the house was a reminder of a rule I had enforced, a boundary I had drawn. The organic soy candles, the ergonomically neutral furniture, the lack of any personal photographs, everything was a testament to my war against the sentimental. And now, without the war, they were just objects. Meaningless, cold, and gray. I tried to reach out to my sisters in the movement. I messaged Victoria and Nia, the women I had trained in the art of the professional execution. I expected solidarity. I expected a counterstrike against vanguard dynamics. The response was a digital wall of silence. 2 days later, I received a notification from a new social justice blog called The Mirror. The headline read, "The Architect of Oppression: How One DEI Strategist Turned Equality into a Gulag." The article was written by a rising radical, a woman named Saffron whom I had mentored. She used all my language. She called my methods proto-fascist. She argued that I was too attached to the old structures of power because I sought to control them rather than dissolve them entirely. She claimed my treatment of Julian was a betrayal of the feminine essence because I had acted like a traditional patriarch in a skirt. She had outperformed me. She had found a way to be even more radical, even more pure. She had declared me obsolete. I watched as my social media accounts were flooded with cancellations. Women I had fought alongside for years were now disavowing my toxic influence. I was being erased from the very movement I had helped define. I was the ideological leak they were now plugging. I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My face looked different. The sharpness of my features, which I had always perceived as a sign of intellectual rigor, now looked like the result of a long, slow starvation. I had spent so much time managing Julian's biology that I had neglected my own. I was thin, pale, and hollow. I went to the kitchen and opened the drawer where I kept my loyalty test files. I pulled out a thick folder labeled Julian. I began to flip through the pages. I saw my own handwriting detailing his failures of spirit. I saw the charts I had made of his compliance levels. And then I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Tucked into the back of the folder was a small, handwritten note on a scrap of paper. It wasn't mine. It was from Julian. It was dated a year ago. Asterisk, Dana, I'm still here because I remember the girl you were before you started trying to fix the world. I'm still here because I'm waiting for her to come back. Please, stop looking for a crime and start looking at me. Asterisk. I stared at the note. I didn't cry. My tear ducts felt as though they had been cauterized by years of emotional discipline. But I felt a strange, jarring sensation in my chest, a mechanical failure of the heart. I had looked for crimes everywhere. I had searched for the historical debt in every word, every gesture, every meal. I had turned my life into an interrogation room, and I was surprised when the person I was questioning finally walked out. I went to the front door and opened it. The neighborhood was quiet. It was a managed community, the kind of place where everyone followed the rules of harmonious living that I had helped draft for the Homeowners Association. Across the street, I saw a neighbor, a man named Robert, washing his car. In my old life, I would have filed a complaint about his excessive water usage and the gendered performance of automotive care. I would have seen his simple Saturday chore as an act of ecological and social defiance. But now, I just watched him. He looked happy. He was whistling a tune I didn't recognize, a melody that hadn't been vetted for cultural sensitivity. He was just a man, washing a car, in a world that was moving on without me. I stepped out onto the porch. The air was warm. It didn't feel ideologically charged. It just felt like air. I realized then that my greatest flaw wasn't my cruelty or my radicalism. It was my belief that I could win. I had thought that by creating a perfect, controlled environment, I could eliminate the human error of existence. I had thought that if I audited every heart and every kitchen, I could finally find peace. But peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of humanity. And I had sacrificed all of it for the sake of the system. I went back inside and closed the door. I didn't lock it. There was nothing left to protect. I walked to the kitchen and picked up the stale bread. I took it to the back garden and crumbled it onto the grass for the birds. It was the first unregulated act I had performed in a decade. I wasn't tracking the waste. I wasn't auditing the impact. I was just feeding the birds. As I stood there, watching a small sparrow peck at a crust of sourdough, I thought about Julian. I wondered where he was. I wondered if he was eating a real breakfast, eggs, bacon, toast with butter. I wondered if he was laughing with someone who didn't analyze his cortisol levels or check his competitive thought patterns. I hoped he was. I went back to my laptop and opened a new document. I didn't write a reclamation strategy or a denial of allegations. I didn't use the words systemic, equity, or rectification. I simply wrote, *, I am Dana. I am 29 years old. And I have spent my life building a cage, only to find that I am the one trapped inside. I hit publish on my blog, the one that used to be a lighthouse for the radical movement. I didn't look at the comments. I didn't wait for the likes or the shares. I just turned off the screen. I walked through my cold, perfect house and sat on the floor of the living room. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have an audit. I didn't have a goal. I just sat in the silence, listening to the sound of my own breath. It was irregular. It was inefficient. It was human. And for the moment, it was enough. The days that followed were a blur of decalibration. Without the structure of my professional life or the mission of my domestic audit, the world felt frighteningly vast and formless. I found myself walking through the local park, watching people. I saw couples arguing, children crying, old men playing chess. I saw all the micro-invalidations and power imbalances that used to set my mind on fire. But now, they just looked like life. Messy, complicated, unfixable life. I went to a grocery store, a real one, not the specialized, ideologically approved co-op I had frequented for years. I walked through the aisles, overwhelmed by the colors and the smells. I saw a man buying a box of sugary cereal, and I felt the old urge to intervene, to educate him on his nutritional debt. I suppressed it. It wasn't my business. It was never my business. I bought a loaf of bread. It was warm, straight from the oven. I didn't check the ingredients. I didn't calculate the caloric load. I just held it in my hands, feeling the warmth seep into my skin. When I got home, I sat at the table, the site of so many calibration sessions, and I ate a slice of bread with real butter. It tasted like nothing I had ever experienced. It tasted like reality. I realized that I had spent years trying to turn the world into a spreadsheet. I had tried to quantify virtue and categorize souls. I had used the language of inclusion to exclude everyone who didn't fit my narrow definition of the evolved human. I had been a tyrant in the name of justice, a jailer in the name of freedom. I picked up my phone. I had one contact I hadn't deleted, one person I hadn't liquidated from my digital life. Julian. I started to type a message. I'm sorry. I stared at the words. They looked small. They looked inadequate against the mountain of files and the years of psychological siege I had put him through. I deleted it. An apology wasn't a rectification. It was just more words. And I had used enough words to last 10 lifetimes. I put the phone down and looked around the room. I needed to change this place. I needed to tear down the ideological fortress. I spent the next week dismantling the house. I threw away the sensors, the trackers, the compliance manuals. I bought a colorful rug. I hung a picture on the wall, a simple landscape of a forest, untamed and unmanaged. I stopped wearing the sharp, clinical suits that were my enforcer uniform. I wore a soft sweater that was a shade of blue I had once deemed too passive. I was no longer the architect of rectification. I was just a person. A person with a lot of damage to repair, starting with herself. One evening, there was a knock at the door. I froze. I hadn't had a visitor since Julian left. I hadn't had a friend in years. I opened the door. It was Marcus, the vice president I had gotten fired from Vanguard Dynamics. He looked different. He wasn't wearing a suit. He looked relaxed, younger. Dana, he said, his voice neutral. Marcus, I replied, my heart hammering against my ribs. What are you doing here? I saw your post, he said. The one where you admitted to building a cage. I looked down at my feet. I meant it. I know, he said. I didn't come here to yell at you. I actually came to thank you. I looked up confused. Thank me? I destroyed your career. You did, he said with a small smile. And at the time, I hated you for it. But after I left, I realized I'd been miserable at that company for a decade. I was chasing a title I didn't want and playing a game I didn't like. Now, I'm consulting for a small nonprofit that actually helps people. I'm happy, Dana. For the first time in a long time. He looked at the house, seeing the changes I had made. It looks like you're trying to find a way out too. I am, I whispered. But I don't know where to go. Just stay here for a while, he said. In the mess. It's where the real work happens. He turned to leave, then stopped. By the way, that Saffron girl? The one who replaced you? She got fired yesterday. Apparently, she wasn't radical enough for the new board. He laughed a warm, genuine sound and walked away. I closed the door and leaned against it. The cycle was continuing. The machine I had helped build was still grinding, still seeking purity, still purging anyone who showed a hint of humanity. But I was no longer off it. I had been ejected, and for the first time, I saw it as a mercy. I went into the kitchen and made a cup of tea. I didn't use a thermometer to check the temperature. I didn't measure the tea leaves for optimal cognitive stimulation. I just made the tea. I sat by the window and watched the sun go down. The sky was a chaotic, beautiful mess of orange, pink, and purple. There was no alignment in the colors. There was no systemic balance. It was just a sunset. I realized then that the world didn't need me to fix it. It didn't need my audits, my protocols, or my purges. It just needed to be lived in. I took a sip of my tea. It was a little too hot, and it didn't have enough sugar. It was imperfect. It was perfect. I spent the following months in a state of quiet re-education. I started reading books that weren't about systemic theory or ideological deconstruction. I read poetry. I read history, real history, full of the contradictions and complexities I had once tried to smooth over with my radical narrative. I learned that humans have always been a mixture of light and shadow, and that trying to cut away the shadow only leaves you in total darkness. I eventually found a job. It wasn't at a high-tech firm or a prestigious consultancy. I started working at a local community center, helping people find housing and employment. There were no ideological tests. There were no historical debts to collect. There were just people in need, and I was just a person with 2 hands and a laptop. I learned to listen. Not the clinical listening I used to do to find weaknesses, but real listening. I heard stories of struggle, of love, of resilience. I saw men and women working together, not as data points in a power struggle, but partners in a difficult world. One afternoon, a man came in. He was looking for help with his resume. He was a veteran, a man who had seen the worst of the old world. He was quiet, respectful, and clearly nervous. In my old life, I would have analyzed his military-industrial complex background. I would have viewed him as an agent of the patriarchy. Now, I just saw a man who wanted to provide for his family. Let's see what we can do, Thomas, I said, pulling up a chair. We worked for 2 hours. We talked about his skills, his experiences, his hopes. We laughed at a joke he told about his old sergeant. It was a simple, human interaction. When we were finished, he shook my hand. Thank you, Dana. You've been real kind. Kind. The word echoed in my mind long after he left. It was a word I had once viewed as a patriarchal trap. Now it felt like the highest accolade I could receive. I walked home that evening, feeling a sense of peace I had never known. The world was still broken. There was still injustice, still pain, still conflict. But I was no longer trying to solve it with a guillotine. I was trying to heal it with a needle and thread, one small stitch at a time. I reached my house, the house that was no longer a lab. I saw a car parked in the driveway. A car I recognized. My heart skipped a beat. Julian was standing on the porch. He looked healthy. He looked whole. I stopped at the edge of the lawn. Julian. Dana, he said. He looked at the house, at the rug visible through the window, at the landscape painting on the wall. You changed the place. I changed a lot of things, I said, my voice trembling. He stepped off the porch and walked toward me. He didn't have a duffel bag this time. He just had his hands in his pockets. I saw your blog, he said. The last post. I meant every word, I said. I'm so sorry, Julian. For everything. For the bread, for the censors, for the way I treated you like a specimen. I was lost in a dream of my own making. He looked at me for a long time. The silence wasn't cold. It was full of the weight of the years we had lost, but also the possibility of the years we could have. I didn't come here to restart the project, Dana, he said quietly. I know, I said. There is no project. There's just us. if you want there to be. He reached out and took my hand. His skin was warm. It wasn't a data point. It was just him. I brought something, he said, reaching into the car. He pulled out a paper bag. The smell was unmistakable. Sourdough. He handed me the loaf. I thought we could have dinner. A real one. I took the bread. I felt the weight of it, the warmth of it. I looked at Julian and saw the man I had almost destroyed, the man who had been brave enough to walk away and kind enough to come back. I'd like that, I said. We went inside. We didn't talk about equity. We didn't talk about systemic debt. We sat at the table and we shared a loaf of bread. We talked about the sunset, about the community center, about the small, imperfect beauty of a life lived without a plan. I was Dana. I was 30 years old. I was no longer an architect of rectification. I was just a woman, sitting in a kitchen with her husband, eating bread in the light of a new world. And it was finally truly enough.